Hello again. It's time for my April wrap-up part 2, and this is where I cover horror books. And like my first wrap-up, if you didn't see, I covered a horror book in the YA section that was kind of a crossover book. And I'm going to cover a YA book in my horror section, because I believe that is also a crossover book. So the YA book I'm going to cover is The Merciless. This is by Daniel Vega. This is a possession book. They call it basically Mean Girls meets The Exorcist. It's a really good book. It's definitely in the horror genre. I feel like, even though it is labeled YA, and anybody who is a fan of horror should probably check this out. That is The Merciless by Daniel Vega. The next horror book I want to cover is My Best Friend's Exorcism. This book is also about possession. This book takes place in the 80s, and it has a lot of 80s references. Every chapter has a 80s song in it. So for example, the first chapter is Don't You Forget About Me. Second chapter is We Got the Beat. Third chapter is That's What Friends Are For. So you can tell there are a lot of 80s references in this book. There actually is a climax in the book that deals with an 80s song as well. So there's definitely a lot of 80s references in this book. I liken this book to probably a horror version of Ready Player One. I feel like, because this has so many 80s references, if you're a fan of the 80s or love anything to do with the 80s, you should definitely check out My Best Friend's Exorcism. It is a great book. I'm going to give it 5 stars. I really love this book, and it is by Grady Hendrix. That is My Best Friend's Exorcism. Next book I covered is Disco Deathtrap. This is by Cameron Robicheaux. This is a self-published author. He has 3 books. He has this one, he has Kill River and Kill River 2. At the time of this, I actually did read Kill River, and I really liked it. I actually liked it a little bit better than Disco Deathtrap, but Disco Deathtrap is still a really good book. It is basically about this event they have on New Year's where they go to a local roller rink. They spend the whole night there at the roller rink. There was a big snowstorm at the roller rink, and of course all these kids are kind of trapped with this serial killer that is kind of dressed up kind of like the Grim Reaper. Of course, madness ensues. A lot of slasher goodness in this book. I did really enjoy this book. A lot of death scenes, a lot of 80s slasher flashbacks in this kind of book. Again, I really enjoyed this book. It's a really easy read, nice quick read, and if you're a fan of any kind of 80s slasher horror, you should definitely pick this up. It is Disco Deathtrap. Next book I'm going to cover is The Bird Box. This is another good book. I had a lot of good books this month. This is another good book. This is about a society that people start going crazy for whatever reason. They don't really know exactly what the reason is, but people start going crazy by what they see outside, and it makes them kill themselves and kill other people and basically go nuts. So the story takes place with this woman and these 2 kids. They have to leave their house and go down the river, and they do it blindfolded. And these kids actually never saw the outside world. So this woman is trying to guide them through to get to safety. And it is really a good book. I really enjoyed it. Very tense book. That is Bird Box by Josh Malaman. A great book. I really enjoyed it. Next book I read was Different Seasons by Stephen King. This contains 4 different stories. It contains Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, which I actually really like. If you've seen the Shawshank Redemption movie, this is a short story that the movie was based on. I think the movie kind of went into a little bit more detail, but the book was still really interesting. It had some parts, obviously, that were different than the movie, and I really did enjoy it. The second book was Apt Pupil, which was really good. I really enjoyed Apt Pupil. I thought it was a great book. I don't remember the movie as well. I remember I liked the movie, but the book seemed pretty detailed and really dark. It was a pretty dark story about a person who finds a person who is basically hiding because he was a person who ran a concentration camp in World War II. And he kind of blackmails this guy to tell him stories, and things kind of get out of hand between this kid and this guy. And it's a really interesting story. I really liked it. Even the ending was really cool, and Apt Pupil was a great book. The Body, if you've seen Stand By Me, The Body was kind of based on that. I wasn't as crazy about The Body as I thought I would be. For some reason, that story wasn't as interesting to me. It was an okay story, but I wasn't as interested in it, and I probably would give that a lower grade than the other 2. I really did like the other 2. The final book was The Breathing Method, which was another really good story. I don't think that it was ever adapted into a movie, but it was a really interesting story, and so in general, I really liked this. books. 3 out of 4 were really good. 1 was okay, not as good as I expected, but a great series of books. That is Stephen King's Different Seasons. The next book I read was I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. It actually had I Am Legend and a couple of other stories I read. I read the I Am Legend for harrowing horror that Kimmy's Corner does. She does a monthly book that she picks, and then she does a detailed review. I will link down her review of this book because she does a really detailed review of this book. I enjoyed this book. It was shorter than the movies. Last Man on Earth is probably the best movie with Vincent Price that kind of nails what this book is about. It's basically about a guy who is in a vampire apocalypse type of environment, and he's basically boarded up in this house trying to fight off these vampires. It has definitely a zombie type feel to it, but I really like the way the book kind of covered his darkness. I think there was a lot more darkness in this story than in the movies. He's a very dark character in this book. There was a little bit of backstory with his wife that I didn't really see in the other movies, and I thought it was really good. I really did enjoy it. That is I Am Legend. The other stories in this book, because it was an anthology of short stories as well, I wasn't as crazy about the short stories. I really didn't feel that great about the short stories, but I Am Legend was a really interesting book, and I really enjoyed it. Next book I read was Coliseum by Patrick Lestuka, who is also the pen name of Craig Davidson, who also has the pen name of Nick Cutter. So this is basically a Nick Cutter book under the Patrick Lestuka name. This is a pretty wild book. I wouldn't recommend it to everybody. I would think the genre I would probably classify this in is probably like a splatter porn type of book. This has some really violent, visceral kill scenes in this book. This story is about a arena, basically, that they house all these prisoners in. Kind of like an Escape from New York type of setting, where they just basically throw all these prisoners into this arena and let's have them just duke it out, kill each other, do whatever they want to do with each other. And the violence in this book is vicious. I mean, I felt like I was watching like a 70s exploitation gore fest book. This is a very violent book. These characters are very vicious characters. There's probably trigger warnings for everything in this book. It's a very short book, but a very powerful book. Like I said, not everybody will like this kind of book, but it's definitely an interesting read if you are interested in that kind of stuff. If you're interested in the really gory type of stuff. There is a horror element at the end, but in general, it is just about these really evil characters who just do really evil things, kill each other in probably the most disgusting ways you could think of. That is what the Coliseum was. And I enjoyed it, but again, I know it's not for everybody. That is the Coliseum. Next book I read was Kill Creek. This was a really good book. I was amazed by this book. This is about 4 horror authors who go to this haunted house as kind of a publicity stunt and get interviewed in this house. The ramifications of what happens in this house affect all of these characters later on, and you start seeing how they have to confront it, go back, and they got to deal with it again because of all of the stuff that's going on. But it is a really powerful book. The prose in this book is great. There's a guy who does a lecture on horror, on gothic horror in the beginning of this book, lays out what gothic horror is in a really good way. I mean, I was really impressed by how he kind of laid out what gothic horror is and then wrote a gothic horror book. So this was a really good story. I really liked all of the characters. They were all really detailed, really interesting twists and turns. An amazing book. If you are a horror fan, I would definitely suggest you read this. This is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. A great book. Next book I read was Vermilion, a novel by Molly Tanzer. This book kind of reminded me of Buffy in a way, or Anita Blake, or something like that, where this woman basically was kind of a ghost hunter type of character, where she dealt with characters that got possessed. They called her a psychopomp. She was from Chinatown. I love the Chinese part of this book. It was kind of really interesting. It wasn't my favorite book, but it wasn't bad. I would probably give it 3.5 stars. It wasn't really as scary as a book. It was definitely more in the action genre than kind of the horror genre in a way. It wasn't a bad book, but it wasn't a great book either. Like I said, I give it 3.5. I think it was an interesting read, but definitely not one of my best. The last physical book I read was Meddling Kids by Edgar Quintero. This book sounded so good. I was so excited to read this. It's basically a story about this detective agency kind of set of kids, base someone on Scooby-Doo. They have a dog. There were 4 characters and a dog. And there was this one last mystery that they solved, and then they stopped the detective agency. And that last mystery was kind of somewhat realistic as far as something horrible was there. Affects all these characters later on, even though they think they unmasked the real culprit in some kind of mask. It really wasn't what was going on. A book like this could have gone 2 ways. It could have gone totally campy, or it could have been dead serious. And I feel like this book kind of skirted in between both of them. It wasn't campy enough. It wasn't serious enough. It dealt with a lot of Cthulhu mythos. There's a lot of Cthulhu references in this book. Even though I haven't read Cthulhu, I can pick up the references in this book. And sadly, I just didn't find it that interesting because it just didn't get campy enough. It didn't get serious enough. It wasn't scary. It wasn't campy. It was just somewhere in between. And it just kind of meandered along. And sadly, I felt like it just was kind of living on nostalgia and didn't really deliver the way it should have been. I was pretty disappointed with this. That was Meddling Kids by Edgar Cantero. And the next book I'm going to talk about is an ebook that I read, which is Wolf Moon, The Rise of the Werewolf. This is the second book in the lycanthropic series. If you go back on my channel when I was a lot heavier and a lot hairier, I covered the first book in this series, Wolf Blood. I really like that series. I really like the first book. Great werewolf book. Very detailed. A large cast of characters. And this book is exactly the same, a large cast of characters. Not as good as the first book, but still pretty good. I still really enjoyed the series. I can't wait until the next book. There was some interesting developments in this book. I don't want to spoil too much if you haven't read the first book. Basically, this series is about a werewolf group started with 3 people who become werewolves and decide to create a werewolf plague. I liken it to The Strain with werewolves, and it's really a detailed book, really an interesting book. In the second book, they kind of detail more as far as what the werewolf curse does, how it affects different people in different ways, giving them different abilities. Some people get smarter, some people get more agile, some people get more strength, and it's really interesting. And again, you see the escalation of the apocalypse. You see the machinations between the people in the werewolf groups that kind of trying to vie for power. And I really enjoyed it. Not as much as the first book, but I still really enjoyed it, and I highly suggest you pick up this series. It is Wolf Moon and Wolf Blood, the lycanthropic series by Steve Morris. And those are all the books I read in the horror genre for April. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.